I'm Lacey Healy. It's summer, and the Arctic is on fire again. Wildfires in Siberia are back. Fires in the north, in moderation, are honestly natural. The mossy summer tundra and boreal forest are places where flames rip through to create a fresh start. But lately, they've become more intense, especially over the past few years.
Smoke and haze as far as the eye can see.
Massive wildfires, which have been burning for weeks.
There was so much smoke, my eyes were sore. We couldn't see the house across the road.
President Vladimir Putin has ordered the army to help firefighters battle the blaze.
Following the order of the president, the Russian Federation and Ministry of Defense are actively fighting the fires in tight cooperation with local authorities.
But this year, Russian military guys who might normally be tasked with fighting fires up there, they're being sent into firefights down south instead. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine is pretty far from the Arctic. But experts are saying that it has the power to significantly change the geopolitical landscape up there. So this summer, we're doing something we've never done before. We're bringing you a special bonus season of Things That Go Boom. 3 episodes called Cold Front. And we're taking you up north. First up, we already know that climate change is a major threat to the circumpolar world as we know it. But what does this mean for people who actually live there? And what does Russia's war on Ukraine mean for how we fight those changes? Today, Katie Toth takes us 250 miles south of the Arctic Circle, to the Canadian city of Yellowknife.
Experiencing the news each day can feel like a journey. With Up First from NPR, it doesn't have to be. Welcome to 15 easy minutes of breaking news, clarity on international and national affairs, all handed over not from some floating voice in the sky, from us, Layla, A, Steve, and me, Rachel. Start your day informed. Subscribe to Up First wherever you get your podcasts.
Yellowknife is a place of transformation. In summer, you can cannonball off a buddy's deck right into the lake. But in March, that same lake is frozen over, ice still thick enough for your F-150. That's why I'm driving to a fish camp run by the Deshinta Center for Research and Learning. We're a few minutes out of town on the ice road. For the past couple weeks, elders and young knowledge keepers have been chopping wood, heading out on skidoos, and pulling nets full of fish out of the ice with anyone who wants to learn. For Randy Baillargeon, it's a way to share what he's learned about his home.
I've been taught so many elders. It's they just teach and everything, and I won't really say no.
Randy's Willaday Yellowknife's Dene, which means we're on his traditional territory right now.
And I've been out on land since I was just a young kid, and just love doing that all my life because that's all I do.
Cool. And so you mentioned you've been taught by so many elders. What have elders told you about how this land is changing? Or I guess maybe that's making assumptions. Is it changing?
Yeah, it is. There's lots of, the snow is changing, the water. Sometimes before we used to get lots of rain and really less rain. And plus too, right now it's winter and sometimes there's not very much snow.
He had just come back from a caribou hunt in the Barren Lands, just north of us, where the forests open up into tundra.
Because every time I hunt, the meat just goes so fast, and I just give it away. It just goes gone, just like that.
But it's getting harder and harder to find a caribou. And the land where he was out looking for them, it was different this time.
In the Barren Land, we're just rough country. Lots of rocks, lots of everything. Even that side of the country is changing too. And it's really hard to get caribou, it's really hard to get muskox, and because it's just really rough on your toboggans, on your skidoo. You just don't know, you might just rip a track and you're hundreds of kilometers away from town and you have no equipment, no nothing. So everything's changing, eh? And outers could see it too, and we could see it as young hunters. And yeah. And yeah. Sorry, there's lots of snow over here.
Randy depends on this time of year to be able to get out on one of those snowmobiles to the places he knows. This region thrives on the cold. You know, sometimes there's this argument that a warming north comes with opportunities, like more arable land here in the subarctic, or further north, longer periods of open Arctic Ocean for shipping. But Mia Bennett with the University of Washington, she says it's more complicated than that.
I think people associate shrinking of sea ice with, instantly increased accessibility, but actually we're entering a period now where the ice is unpredictable. There's still a lot of ice, but it's maybe in smaller fragments. It's harder to model accurately, so it's still treacherous waters for ships to navigate, treacherous to carry out a lot of infrastructure development, and particularly on land with permafrost thawing, that renders the ground less stable, so it's harder to build asphalt roads. Even ice roads are being jeopardized by shorter seasons.
In other words, the north that people love is under threat. But northerners have faced down threats before.
We were very much concerned with nuclear weapons and nuclear activity that obviously would be deleterious for not only us in the Arctic region, but indeed the entire globe.
Daly Samboduro is the president of the Inuit Circumpolar Council. It's a group that represents Inuit in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, and Russia.
We emerged in the context of the Cold War, aware that the activities concerning militarization were taking place around us, the forced relocation of our communities and the demolition of our traditional, even elements of food storage.
For decades, Inuit on both sides of the Iron Curtain had seen military escalation on their territories. War games on the lands people used to hunt and fish, families relocated to make way for military sites. People sent to hostile parts of the Arctic where no one had ever lived in the name of national security. This all sets the stage for their first meeting in the 70s. It's a time of coming together, sharing ideas about process, sovereignty, environmentalism, what this new group is going to look like. But Inuit from one country are missing. So there's a resolution calling on the USSR to encourage delegates from the East Arctic land of Chukotka to join the next conference.
To join with us as, again, our direct blood relations across this imposed national border in an effort to unify our people in order to ensure that we as Arctic Indigenous peoples are recognized and respected on the basis of who we are as distinct peoples.
In later years, the council would leave empty seats at meetings to symbolize the absence of people from the Soviet Arctic. In fact, the USSR refused to send delegates until more than a decade later. But at this first meeting, when everything was just getting started, there was one idea that would eventually be echoed by the Soviet Union.
One of the resolutions that was adopted in 1977 at the Utqiagvik Organizing Conference related to the peaceful use of the Arctic.
10 years later, Mikhail Gorbachev calls for the same thing in the Murmansk Declaration. He says the Arctic should be a zone of peace, one where instead of state power competition, this place is set aside for solving big problems. And eventually that zone of peace actually happens for decades. You know, probably the biggest example of this is the Arctic Council, which sits both the Inuit Circumpolar Council and other Indigenous delegations as permanent participants, beside nation-states like Denmark and the United States. They talk about the North's future when it comes to anything non-military.
I think it's important to say that despite all of these different political arenas, we have remained steady as Inuit, and we remain committed to ensuring that we're always here, despite all of the waves that we have seen come and go. And this is, I think,
So does it ever get weird for the Inuit Circumpolar Council to be sitting at the table with some of those same nation states, given that history? Yeah, sometimes.
Here in Alaska, the village of Koktovik suffered a forced relocation at the hands of the U.S. Air Force. There are many, many other examples of impact. But in my estimation, what happened in Kaktovik is probably one of the more severe examples of demolition of an entire community and destruction of even burial remains and other important, and I think it's safe to say, sacred elements of the community. It's necessary to engage in dialogue in order to reveal that these facts, they are facts of history that have been overshadowed by the agendas and the forces and the desires of nation states. But in order to reveal the facts, it's necessary to engage in dialogue. If we chose not to engage, I think we would be far worse off.
But now, once again, the engagement that the Inuit Circumpolar Council fought for, it's gotten a lot more tricky.
Everything has changed since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? So that's put a lot of things up in the air that previously, I think, folks took for granted, one of which was this idea of Arctic exceptionalism, and the idea that the Arctic was somewhat immune from geopolitical conflicts going on elsewhere.
And that has some pretty big implications for how we solve our climate change problem. That's after the break.
The Arctic is an ideal lab in many ways for studying climate change because it's already changing. It's changing 4 times as fast as many of the lower latitude regions.
When climate journalist Andrea Pitzer thinks of the North, she doesn't see a pristine, icy landscape. She thinks of the 2019 trip she took to learn about mapping trash.
Which is like not at all sexy. Of course, it is climate related because all that plastic was produced through industrial methods, which is part of why we have the climate change that we do. These plastics have real consequential effects.
This mapping trip, it felt like this moment of coming togetherness.
Mapping the plastics, nobody had even done it on this one whole sea. And these were the first 2 scientists who were doing that. You know, there are so many problems that we are still at the forefront of figuring out how to deal with.
Andrea was on a Russian boat with American, Norwegian, and Russian scientists. Not everyone spoke the same language, but in the evenings, they'd stumble through party games anyway.
In my lifetime, in the Soviet era, I was born in 1968, so for the first 2 decades of my life, there would have been no way for an American to be on a Russian boat that was not part of some very formal, very observed, with intelligence agents there and all that. But an American journalist of all things, right? To be on a boat with scientists from another country and doing this work unsupervised, that there would be enough trust to have this kind of research carried out.
Andrea went back to Russia just before the war against Ukraine. She was hoping to meet up with some of the scientists she'd talked to before. But before she got the chance, Putin announced his invasion. She got out of Moscow ASAP.
I was horrified for the Ukrainians who are suffering more than anybody in all this. I mean, they're suffering more than science, more than any of it. But I was also sad that these things that I had seen not exist when I was a teenager and a child come to fruition as an adult so that people could do this kind of great collaboration and work together, and then to have that vanish overnight. And everybody knew it.
Suddenly, decades of collaboration had frozen over.
1 week after Russia invaded Ukraine, the Arctic Council announced it was suspending all its activities because of the war.
Well, the Arctic Council office is in this building, and they are, of course, on hold.
All of a sudden, that cooperation is on pause.
Days after Russia's invasion, every other Arctic member state asked the country for a pause in proceedings. I mean, Russia was chairman this year. How do you show up to meetings devoted to environmental cooperation or consensus building in the Arctic when the leading figure is invading another country? It's a sentiment echoed by a lot of people in the science and policy world.
I interviewed Kim Holman, who is with the Norwegian Polar Institute. He said, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that when it comes to sort of the indiscriminate death and slaughter of people, we have to give precedence to that in an immediate way.
At the same time, some crises don't wait for wars to be over.
You can't study currents. You can't study ice flow. You can't study migratory animals if they are crossing from space to space. You literally can't study the thing you need to study without that kind of collaboration. It's like 15,000 miles of shoreline on the Arctic Ocean, is in Russian territory.
The impacts of climate change have not been paused, right? I mean, it would be great if we could do that.
That's Daily Samboduro again. U.S. diplomats have said we will get back to full cooperation at the Arctic Council with all its members as soon as possible, but it's up to Russia when that happens. And we can't just sit around waiting for that. So in June, officials announced the other countries in the Arctic Council would get back to work on some topics without Russia. That was a few months after I talked to Daly. According to an article in Arctic Today, the relevant states did not give the Inuit Circumpolar Council a chance to consult on this in advance. On the flip side, there are some cooperation carve-outs happening with Russia. Norway is still working with Russia on search and rescue and oil spill preparedness. But it does feel like climate change and the environment have been put on the back burner by international bodies.
These are still important issues for us, and they have interrelated impacts. If we think about, for example, food security and the impacts of climate change on our food security, and then you add another layer of intensity in terms of the conflict, it's really difficult to know what's going to happen in the future.
Biden's been racing to get more oil flowing. Domestic fracking has re-entered the chat. And for Arctic science, Andrea sees the war hampering collaboration on some huge issues.
And it's a grotesque thing to have to think about. But likely, if the war does not end soon, and it shows no signs of ending soon, we will have to weigh some of those trade-offs, this sort of horrific calculus of millions of people, maybe more, living in uninhabitable quadrants of the globe if we don't act, and tens of thousands. Who knows if it will go to hundreds of thousands of people potentially losing their lives right now in a war. Those are two things that should never be set against each other, but we may have to figure out how to continue with the research while the horrors are still ongoing. And I think the enormity of what Russia has done still has to be observed, still has to be acknowledged, and maybe there is some kind of set aside that we still keep this work paused for now out of not just respect for that, but to take the time to realize the cost of what it is we do if we continue, for people to assess that in a strategic way. I think at some point, and I don't know when that is, I think there's a question of, do we sort of enter a Cold War phase 2 approach where there are certain kinds of science that are collaborated on?
But for many American and European scientists, entering that phase anytime soon feels impossible. Even though some Russian scientists have put themselves at risk by speaking out against war, other scientists outside Russia are still nervous about making things worse by reaching out.
There are many scientists who regularly partner with Russian researchers who are not even in contact with them right now in an attempt to try to keep them safe from the punishments that might be inflicted on them if they're seen to be collaborating with unfriendly foreign powers.
And we can't forget, lots of Russians do support the invasion of Ukraine.
Let's say you didn't know, but you found out now that this person that you really liked and worked with is a huge Putin fan or has kind of drunk the Kool-Aid for their career. How do you camp out and work with that person, and what does it mean to you if you do that? Does it change you?
Beyond the one-on-one dynamics, a lot of the assets used for Russian research and exploration, like ships, have military ties.
If this is the same military that is raping and bombing civilian targets and individuals in Ukraine, what is the morality of putting Western scientists on ships? It's one thing to just get security permits from the FSB to go these places. It's another thing if you become part of a military expedition.
Whatever happens, Andrea says it needs to address the urgency of the climate crisis because it could be even worse than we know.
What if it turns out that there are accelerating factors that we're not even aware of?
One example is thawing permafrost.
So this ground that's sort of always been frozen, it's thawing at astonishing rates, and you have stuff in that soil, and then you've got microbes that start eating it, and they start releasing carbon dioxide and methane. And we didn't account for so much of this permafrost in a lot of the studies that have been done. And so now what we have is the Arctic, which typically has been a bank for carbon. It's been something that helps protect us from climate change. Suddenly we have this huge force that's happening all across different parts of the Arctic, whether it's the Russian Arctic or the Norwegian or the Canadian Arctic, where you have microbes generating the very things that we're trying to get rid of in the atmosphere.
Permafrost thaw is something Deshinta fish camp teacher Noel Cockney knows all about. The changing climate has made the coastline where his family lives so weak that his mom had to move their childhood home in Tuktoyaktuk from the edge of the Arctic Ocean further inland. That's not the only change he's noticed either.
Along the coast of the ocean, there are families that are catching an increase more of salmon, which are coming along the Alaskan coast to where we are, which is kind of unusual. Just with the increase of temperature in the oceans, I'm sure it's just going to be eventual that we'll have more of that happening, and could disrupt a lot of the Arctic char population just trying to compete for their food sources.
Noel says with these kinds of stakes, having as many people as possible dealing with the climate crisis is important, but he cannot let the invasion of Ukraine slide. So right now, he wouldn't want to see any affiliation happening with Russia. It's a question that feels so far from where we started the show and where Noel still has a class to teach.
At least my family, we make our dry fish a little bit differently than a lot of people down here.
Noel's sharing how to make dry fish in his family's style further up north on that Arctic coastline I was telling you about. He's a Inuvialuit. That's the name for Inuit who live just next door to Alaska.
For us, to share that respect for the animal, we cut the bottom fins off.
The bright pink flesh of fish fold themselves over wooden bars in this little cabin. Old smoke from the wood stove fills the air.
So once we cut the fins off, we cut the head off, just being very careful with the bladder that's really close to the head there.
Noel slices through the fish's silvery skin, expertly pulling the organs out, each one connected to another.
As I cut into it, you'll hear the cracking noise of the bones that are going from the muscles straight towards the spine.
It would be easy to end this by saying traditions like Noel's are what's at stake if we don't find a way to put a brake on climate change that also aligns with our values. But I think that kind of ending would disrespect everything that Inuvialuit have lived through before.
Us as Indigenous people, and not just Inuvialuit, Gutchin, or Dene people, but just Indigenous people in general, we have to find a way to just adapt to it, because that's exactly what my ancestors had to do. Just a part of our lives that we have to unfortunately accept to an extent.
For Inkstick Media, I'm Katie Toth.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. This episode was produced by Katie Toth with a little bit of help from me. It was edited by Nikki Galtland, Christina Stella, Sahar Khan, and Denize Nakeko. Thanks to Thomas Smith at the London School of Economics and Amber Soya at NASA for helping us with our facts on Siberian wildfires. And to William Taguna at the first Inuit Circumpolar Conference for helping us get our facts right about what happened in 1977. Thanks to the band Pilksilk for our theme song for this project, and to Nanook for the background tunes. Additional music for our show was by Darian Schulman, as always. And, also as always, Robin Wise makes each episode sound its very, very best. Thank you to the supporters and foundations that make our work possible. the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as Inkstick's supporters, including the Coulomb Foundation, Craig Newmark Foundation, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. If you're listening and you like what we do, please don't forget to head on over and leave us a review. And come visit us anytime on social at Inkstick Media. We'll see you right back here with the next episode in our bonus season, Cold Front, in 2 weeks.
So once we take the meat off of the spine and the ribs, so there's the belly part, this fatty part. So we cut real along the outside of that, and then after we go along each side, we cut right down the middle to split the fish right in half there.